Little group. Let's get started. Here we go. It is difficult to gauge the exact nature of the ties between this American patron and the resident workers. An article that appeared in the Eureka Semi-Weekly Union in 1864 accused Bidwell of keeping, quote, a slave pen at Rancho Chico, and alluded to an incident in which the indigenous man had been beaten with a club while his hands and feet were tied together over a barrel. The article urged Bidwell to stop the hypocrisy and supporting the abolition of black slavery while at the same time enslaving indigenous peoples. For this part, Bidwell contended that the natives at Rancho Chico, had never been profitable to him, and that his only objective had been to protect them. The record makes clear that this was disingenuous. Bidwell deprived tangible advantages by having a stable workforce on site. At the same time, he protected, quote, his indigenous peoples on more than one occasion. Gosh dang it. Hold on a second, everybody. On more than one occasion. In one dramatic instance, in July 1863, he defended the ranch indigenous people when they were accused of the brutal killing of 2 white children nearby. He even faced an armed mob led by an outraged father, Samuel Lewis, and went so far as to call out the army rather than allow his resident indigenous people to be murdered or driven away. The last phase in the involving relations between Bidwell and the Manchopadas began in 1868 when the aging owner married Annie Kennedy, a young socially active woman who was also a devout Presbyterian. For the past 20 years, Bidwell and the Manchopadas had forged a mutual convenient arrangement with the indigenous people, providing some service for him around the Rancho Chico, while still being able to retain much of their culture. The close ties between protector and protected are best illustrated by the Nampeni, an indigenous woman in her late 20s or early 30s who worked in Bidwell's as a cook and a housekeeper. Bidwell enjoyed no pennies cooking, including her grasshopper cake, which she proudly referred to his guests. No Penny was also served as a key intermediary between the American ranchers and the Manchopadas. When Annie Bidwell began take control of the household after 1868, No Penny reportedly confronted her and tried to put her in her place. No, me, Miss Bidwell, number 1. You, Miss Bidwell, number 2. Although it is not possible to confirm the accuracy of this exchange, and one can only speculate about the true nature of the relationship between John Bidwell and No Penny. We do know that Annie Bidwell did not let things stand. She replaced all the indigenous house servants with Chinese cooks and Irish maids. The changes did not stop there. When the Manchopadas disrupted Annie's sleep with their morning ceremonies, which lasted late into the night, she had an entire rancheria moved to another site about a mile away from the house. And he also set out to instruct a group of native people whom she regarded as much too wild. Her civilizing and religious campaigns especially targeted the children, but also they were aimed at a few adults. One of Annie's pupils, Elmer Las Fanzo, gained some fame in the community for singing gospel songs, like Bon with a fine baritone voice. A blind indigenous person named Austin McLean became a violin player, and a group of natives formed a brass band that played in the 4th of July parade and at other celebrations. In the end, upon her death in 1918, Annie Bidwell deeded 28 acres of land to the Rancheria. This final act of generosity, however, failed to provide a stable home for the Mecapodas. Eventually, the federal government took over the land Annie had left to them. And Bidwell's was their relatively benevolent patron. Captain John Sutter was the personification of the hard-driving frontier entrepreneur. From the time of his arrival in California in 1839, this Swiss-born officer was bent on carving out an empire for himself. As he put it, quote, "I prefer a country where I should be absolute master," end quote. Carrying an armful of letters and introductions that surrounded by his European and Hawaii employees, Sutter took pains in project and the aurora of confidence, health, and far-reaching visions. This theatrics must have worked on some level. In short order, he obtained a grant from the California government selecting a propitious embankment by the Sacramento River and began building an establishment that looked more like a fort than a farm. He was soon able to parlay his meager resources into a representative enterprise. A Swiss doctor named Sandals visited Sutter's fort in 1843, 4 years after it was built. Dr. Settles was taken by the beauty of the landscape as he ascended to Sacramento River with its many turns and luscious canopies on both sides. He also was impressed by the scale of Sutter's building and two-story quadrangular adobe structure enclosing a very large area. Dr. Sandals arrived very early in the morning and found Captain Sutter already issuing orders for the day. It was time for the wheat harvest, and the place was bustling as several hundred indigenous people flocked in for their morning meal. They rushed towards several throws made of hollowed out tree trunks, and in the middle of the patio, crouching on their haunches, they reached into a trough with their bare hands and scooped up a thin porridge, which they quickly stuffed into their mouths. Quote, "I must confess, I could not recounsel my feelings to see these fellows," end quote. Dr. Sandals would later write in his memoirs, quote, "as they fed more like beasts than human beings," end quote. After having, quote, half satisfied their physical wants, end quote, they were given sickles and hooks and driven off to the fields. Fellow Euro-Americans, Captain Sutter came across as a a fabled frontiersman, frank and generous, but his outsized ambitions also made him imperious to demanding towards his dependents. To sustain his fort, Sutter bought cattle and foodstuff on credit from his neighbor. Indeed, throughout his life, the Swiss officer had shown a propensity to take on more debt than was prudent. Quote, he would perhaps have bought anything at any price if it could be obtained on credit. End point. Appending the 19th century historian Hubert Howe Bancroft, and in 1841 the already overextended Sutter was presented with the buying opportunity of a lifetime. Since the dawn of the 19th century, the Russian Empire was explored the west coast of North America, from Alaska to California. In 1812, the Russians bolstered their presence by establishing Fort Ross by Bodega Bay. For some years, this outpost near the rugged coast of Northern California thrived, but when the population of sea otters began to decline due to the overhunting, the Russians decided to sell their fort, which consisted of 24 main buildings, complete with wooden floors and glass windows, 10 kitchens, 8 sheds, and 8 bathhouses. They identified Captain Sutter as a possible buyer. In early September 1841, the governor of Fort Ross, Alexander Rochevs, made his way to Sutter's home with a surprising offer to sell him the entire fort and its outlying ranches, including furnishing tools and cattle, for $30,000. Sutter already owed nearly $4,000 to the Russian-American company. The price of the fort would simply be added to his existing account. Sutter was elated by the opportunity to flattered by the confidence of Russians placed in him. The contracting parties drew up a payment plan. Sutter would pay the company only $2,000 in 1841, but his payments would increase to $5,000 in 1842, and in 1843, then balloon to $10,000 in 1844 and 1845. In the cash-starved economy of Mexican California, however, these enormous sums could only be paid in kind. For Captain Sutter, this meant thousands of bushels of wheat and hundreds of quintal of silk, peas, beans, suet, and tallow. Of 1 quintal of colonial Mexico equaled 46 kilograms, or about 100 pounds. Ever the optimist, and without thinking too much, Sutter accepted the terms. After all, he had lived on credit all his life. To meet this enormous obligation, Sutter resorted to every tool in the labor kit. Sutter's fort laid on the border between the Mayaks and the Niceans, so he began luring workers from these groups by giving out presents of beads, blankets, and shirts. He also ostensibly cultivated Miwok and Nicean headmen. Once these indigenous people had moved close to Sutter's fort, its proprietor offered them porridge every morning, as Dr. Sandal's a witness, and paid them with clothes. In fact, Sutter established something of a company store system. In lieu of cash, indigenous laborers received metal discs that they donned as necklaces. Star-shaped holes were punched in the disc to keep track of the amount of work they did. They could then redeem the discs in Sutter's store. 2 weeks of work would earn a cotton shirt or a pair of pantaloons. This sounds like how prisons are set up. You do a little bit of work, you get commissary. Interesting. Is using this method, Captain Sutter was able to attract and maintain hundreds of Miwoks and Niceans for each working season. But in addition to dangle carrots, Captain Sutter also resorted to a proverbial sick. The famous trailblazers John C. Fremont visited Sutter's fort in 1843 to 1844. He noted that at first the proprietors had faced some difficulties with the indigenous laborers, quote, but by the occasional exercise of well-timed authority, he had succeeded in converting them into peaceable and industrious people. After settling down in California, Sutter's first objective had been to raise a private army. At first, it consisted of a small group of white men, but it soon grew to about 150 infantrymen and 50 cavalry, the majority of them indigenous soldiers. They wore uniforms acquired from the Russians, green and blue with red trim, and responded to commands issued in German. It was an unusual marshaled display of the wilds of California. One of the occupations of this army was to persuade reluctant and uncooperative indigenous peoples to work. The Nicean men, named William Joseph, recalled that although Sutter paid his workers, if they failed to work, his henchmen, quote, whipped them with a big whip made of cowhide, end quote. Working for Sutter was evidently not a choice, but an obligation, especially in the critical years when a large payment of Russian-American companies were due. Sutter's private army also allowed him to participate in the indigenous slave trade. Over the years, Sutter learned much about this traffic. As he wrote in his personal reminiscences, quote, it was common in those days to seize indigenous women and children to sell them. This the Californians did as well as indigenous. I don't agree. Early on, Captain Sutter had to deal with slavers operating in his domain. In the fall 1840, a group of indigenous people from the mission of San Jose arrived in Sutter's fort. They were bearing passports from the Vajos and asked for permission to visit some of their friends and relatives in the area. Instead, however, they struck a nearby rancheria of Niceans while the men were away working for Sutter's, killing the elderly and carrying off the women. The attackers intended to sell the prisoners to the ranches of the coast, quote, as was common in those days. But this was not to be. Sutters personally led the detachment of soldiers in pursuit of the marauding indigenous people, caught the proprietors, and brought them to his fort for execution. Such experiences paved Sutter's way into the slaving business, but what really pushed him into the traffic was the need to push hostile indigenous people and the realization that this could be done in an economically advantageous manner. Sutter's presence by the Sacramento River had polarized the indigenous inhabitants. Some Miwoks and Niceans were his allies and laborers, however reluctantly, but many others refused to submit and attempt to steal from Sutter and even murder him. In 1844 and 1845, when Sutter's political influence was on the wane, grain and huge payments to the Russians were due, he opted to use an iron fist on the natives. Quote, "I see now how it is," Sutter wrote to his most trusted agents who was in the process of developing a new farm. Quote, "If they are not kept strictly under fear, it will be no good." Sutter's personal army came alive in those years, persuading unreliable laborers, breaking up bands of hostile indigenous people, pushing cattle hustlers. All of these activities became potential sources of slaves. Unguarded private letters revealed the deliberate way in which Sutter approached this line of business. "I shall send you some young indigenous peoples," Sutter wrote to his neighbor, the creditor Antonio Sanuel, in May 1845, quote, "After our campaign against horse thieves, which will take place after the wheat harvest," end quote. A few weeks later, true to his word, Sutter dispatched 31 indigenous people, quote, as usually die of hunger. Some other such transactions have come to light. It is difficult to gauge the full scope of Sutter's slaving activities. In Hubert Howey's Bancroft, Momental History of California, based on many first-hand accounts, including Sutter's, the historians concluded that from the start, the Swiss captain had seized indigenous children, quote, who were retained as servants or slaves to his own establishment or sent to his friends in different parts of the country, end quote. Similarly, Albert Hartido, the scholar who is most familiar with Sutter's correspondence, was observed that the indigenous peoples' war undoubtedly helped Sutter's improve his balance sheet vis-a-vis his creditors. One of Sutter's employees, Heinrich Linhart, even claimed that his boss kept a harem of indigenous women and young girls in a room right next to his office. These accusations, while plausible, remained uncorroborated. Although Captain Sutter combined some features of the appanage system with occasional slave raiding, other Euro-American settlers became more specialized in the traffic of indigenous people. Andrew Kelsey and his brothers arrived in California in the first overwhelming wagon trail from Missouri in 1841. By 1844, Andrew, Benjamin, and Samuel had settled in Napa Valley, where they raised cattle for the towing trade. During these years, the Kelseys interacted closely with the Vigils, who lived in the adjacent valley. The Kelseys, as well as other ranchers in the area, relied on indigenous workers brought from a Clear Lake region directly to the north. Today, State Route 29 runs north through the wineries of Napa Valley before meandering through Mount St. Helens and descending to Clear Lake. Visitors are astounded by the size of the lake, the largest freshwater lake entirely within California. Lake Tahoe straddles the California-Nevada border. Though far less famous than the Napa Valley today, Clear Lake has its own share of visitors who enjoyed the houses of condos along the shore. The lake itself is alive with water skiers, kayakers, and motorboaters. Fortunately, Clear Lake is large enough to accommodate these human activities and still sustains remarkable wildlife. Egrets, herons, bald eagles, hawks, ospreys, and many other birds can be spotted in the area. Anglers are especially keen on the lake's base. Clear Lake ranks as one of the top bass fishing spots in the United States and is sometimes called, quote, the bass capital of the West. It is precisely this natural abundance that has made Clear Lake a magnet for human population since the time immemorial. Hello. In the early 19th century, the lake was even bigger than it is today. It supported 18 different rancherias, each consisting of about 100 to 150 individuals occupying different islands or portions of the shore. They were mostly Homo indigenous people. Lake. Each band claimed some land and hunting grounds and enjoyed a diverse diet. In the spring, the indigenous people caught the plentiful fish swimming upstream in baskets trapped, or even with their bare hands. In the summer, they dived for clams and dug up roots to eat. In the fall, they gathered acorns and hunted the thousands of waterfowls descending on the lake. Even though they possessed the extraordinarily varied and abundant supply of food, the indigenous people of the lake also traded actively among themselves and with more distant tribes. The lake rancherias exchanged everyday necessities such as fish, baskets, animal skins, and clams. From the coast, they import salt and seashells, while exporting in return obsidian for nearby Mount St. Helens, an extinct volcano, fish, and acorns. Despite being threatened by smallpox in the 1830s, the total indigenous population lived around Clear Lake in the early 1840s was probably about 3,000. The first outsiders to establish a beachhead in Clear Lake has none other than Salvador Vajo. Around 1839 to 1840, he built a log house in a corral on the southern shore of the lake, just north of the present-day Kinsleyville. It was little more than a rude wooden shelter and a few poles driven into the ground, forming a kind of stockade. The young Vajo kept a Morandium caretaker there to manage the place and direct a dozen or so Homo indigenous people who constructed buildings, maintained the property, and tended the horses and cattle brought from Sonoma. Subsequently, on the basis of these improvements, Vajo applied for a land grant encompassing much of the southern shore. From time to time, Salvador Vajo also visited Clear Lake to recruit indigenous workers for their ranches in Sonoma and Napa, thus setting an important precedent. In one notorious expedition in 1843, he led a group of mighty Mexican ranchers and as many indigenous allies into the region. The writer's first attempt unsuccessfully to recruit the Khoi indigenous people by giving them beads and other presents while asking them to relocate to the Mexican ranches. Next, they approached the Elm indigenous people on the Rattlesnake Island, who also refused. Finally, they reached the Kamdot indigenous people, who organized a great council in the Temescal, or sweat houses, to which Vajo was invited. The indigenous people began gathering in the conical structure, about the size of a circus ring, by the lake. The building was completely enclosed except for a small hole at the top to let out the smoke. The only way out, or the only way in or out, was through a narrow tunnel that would be used by only one person at a time. The participants set a fire in the middle of the structure, and once they were sweating profusely, they would escape through the tunnel to plunge into the lake. According to Vajo's own version of the events, he believed that the sweat house's inventation was a ruse. Some with half the indigenous men outside, naked and unarmed. He and his men set the building on fire while blocking the tunnel. Then the rest of the men, quote, the squans of children were made prisoners and driven down into Napa Valley and there compelled to go do work. A prize of 300 indigenous peoples, young and old, male and female. The American takeover of California forced the Vajos to consolidate their holdings. In 1874, Salvador Vajo sold his Clear Lake cattle operation to Andrew Kinsley, a younger American named Charles Stone. The two partners promptly relocated to the southern shore of the lake and threatened and treated the indigenous like slaves. They forced 400 to 500 Pomo indigenous people to build a sturdy adobe house measuring about 40 feet long and 50 feet wide, complete with fireplace. In only 2 months, the Americans meted out cruel punishment for minor infractions. Perhaps the very isolation of these two white men living in a remote outpost, completely surrounded by natives, as well as the need to keep firm control, prompting them to terrorize the local inhabitants. Whatever the cause, the accounts of both whites and indigenous are consistent. Americans who stayed with Kinsley and Stone reported that their hosts flogged indigenous people for entertainment and even shot random indigenous people just for fun of seeing them jump. Thomas Knight, an American who settled in the Napa Valley in 1845, said that one of the preferred methods of punishment was to hang indigenous people by their thumbs in the adobe house for 2 to 3 days, allowing their toes to just touch the floor. Kinsley and Stone also raped young indigenous women. Indeed, according to another white Napa Valley resident, one of their motivation for relocating to remote Clear Lake was to gain the freedom to satisfy, quote, their unbridled lust among the youthful females. Jesus Christ, these guys are sick. In the meantime, the conscriptions of indigenous people continued. In 1848, Kinsley and Stone rounded up 172 indigenous people and had them driven to the ranches of Napa and Sonoma for compulsory work. The discovery of gold brought them more misery to the indigenous people of the lake. In the fall of 1849, the two partners sent around 50 Pomo indigenous people to the headwaters of the Sacramento River to pan for gold. The timing of this venture could not have been worse. At the absolute peak of gold fever, throngs of prospectors from Oregon to Southern California were converging on the region. Benjamin Kingsley drove the Pomos to the gold fields without incident, but once there, he realized that the hordes of prospectors had created an acute shortage of provisions. Basic foodstuffs were fetching extremely high prices. Thus, Kinsley was persuaded that he and the other investors would be better off if they simply sold their provisions rather than look for gold. And so he liquidated his supply, leaving the indigenous people to fend for themselves. Hunger was not the only peril. The gold fields were in an area surrounded by the traditional enemies of the Pomo. An outbreak of malaria made their situation even more difficult. Of the 50 or so indigenous people who went to the gold fields, only 3 made it back to Clear Lake. As one contemporary chronicler wrote, quote, sons and brothers who had gone away in the full prime of their manhood had fallen victims to hunger, disease, and the enemy's bows and arrows, end quote. When the survivors returned and the news of their ordeal spread, the Pomos became infuriated. Still, Kinsley and Stone remained undaunted. In fact, they added insult to injury by planning to relocate all the indigenous people of the lake to the Sacramento River by Sutter's Fort. According to an Augustinian Augustine, a Pomo chief, worked as overseer or the two partners. The idea was to drive everyone away except indigenous Vasqueros, working directly in the cattle operation. To that effect, they commanded the indigenous people to make rope, quote, to bind the young men and the refractory ones, so as to be able to make the move into Sacramento Valley. But having endured 2 years of unrelenting and vicious exploitation, having mourned the deaths of dozens of their brothers sent to the goldfields, and facing the prospects of mass relocation, quote, finally the indigenous people made up their minds to kill Stone and Kinsley. For day to day, they got worse and worse in their treatment of them, declaring Chief Augustine a few years later, quote, and an indigenous people thought that they might as well die one way as another, so they decided to take the final fatal steps, end quote. On the one morning in December 1849, the indigenous people charged the adobe house, killing Kinsley and Stone with arrows and striking their heads with rocks. The specific details of these killings vary from one version to another, but they all agreed that the end of the two partners was gruesome. The scant literature on the early history of Clear Lake focuses on the cruelty of Andrew Kinsley and Charles Stone and the episodic massacres, but it tends to overlook a large point. Although the two American partners may have been unusually, even pathologically cruel, they were able to enslave these indigenous peoples because such activities were common throughout the region, and there was a thriving market for indigenous slaves. Indeed, their deaths did not stop the trafficking of Clear Lake indigenous people. The trade resumed in 1850 and became especially active in 1854 to 1857, when traffickers, revolvers in hand, regularly descended on small indigenous band, shot the men and sometimes the women, and caught the boys and girls between the ages of 8 and 14. Quote, not many of the present generations of Californians know, end quote, wrote Henry Clay Bailey, a Kentuckian who arrived in California in mid-century, quote, that in the early 50s, a regular slave trade was carried on in the mountain bordering the upper Sacramento Valley from Clear Lake to Strong Creek, unquote. The bounty of resources at the lake sustained a significant indigenous population where that slavers continued to tap for years. The prevalence of other slavery in the mid-19th century was reflected in legal statuses. Even as California hung in the balance between Mexico and the United States on September 15, 1846, Captain John B. Montgomery commanded the Northern Department of California, issuing a proclamation warning people who, quote, have been and still are holding to service indigenous people against their will, end quote, to detest and urging the general public to not regard indigenous people, quote, in the light of slaves, end quote. Yet the proclamation went on to state that all indigenous living in the settled portions of California could not, quote, wander about in an idle and dissolute manner, end quote, but were required to obtain employment once their contracts have been fulfilled and their debts paid off. They were free to leave their employers, but they had to find another employer to master immediately, or they were liable to be arrested and drafted into public works. The next step in the process of formalizing the peonage system was to give teeth to Montgomery's proclamation, which is exactly what Henry W. Halleck Secretary of State of California, did by introducing a certificate and pass system in 1847. All employers were required to issue certificates of employment to their indigenous workers. If these workers had to travel for any reason, such as to visit friends or relatives or to trade, they also had to secure a pass from the local authorities. These certificates and passes allow employers to local officials to monitor and control the movements of indigenous people. Quote, any indigenous person found beyond the limits of the town or rancho in which he may be employed without such certificate or pass, end quote. Hellick's order, quote, will be liable to arrest as a horse thief, and if on being brought before the civil magistrate he failed to give a satisfactory account of himself, he will be subjugated to a trial and punishment, end quote. This system accomplished a number of goals. It allowed ranchers to hold indigenous people in place, as the certificate typically listed the, quote, advanced wages, end quote, that had to be repaid before the certificate bearer would be free to go. This was a very cornerstone of the peonage system. The certificate and pass system also sought to minimize conflicts amongst employers. Understandably, indigenous people often fled from ranches and mines and took up work with other employers. With these documents, prospective employers could determine at a glance if an indigenous person seeking employment had any outstanding debts. And finally, the pass system went beyond previous ordinances in distinguishing between natives, gainfully employed, and all others regardless of where they lived, who were automatically considered vagrants or horse thieves and therefore subject to the labor draft. Captain Montgomery's 1846 proclamation and Secretary Hellick's in 1847 pass systems were important steps in the process of enshrining the peonage system into law. But by far the most sweeping piece of California labor legislation during the pre-Civil War era at the Act of the Government and Protections of Indigenous Peoples of 1850, as usually, this benign sounding law was not what it purported to be. The committee that crafted it included the Bernal Morandio Guadalupe Vajo, David F. Douglas, a Southerner from Tennessee with plenty of experience with the peculiar institution, and John Bidwell, and the only moderate in the group. Bidwell was ill at the time, however, so it was up to the Mexican ranchers and the former Tennessean to hammer out the final details. Their proposal quickly passed both houses on April 19, 1850, and was signed into law 3 days later. It was an unwieldy piece of legislation containing 20 sections. Some of them were largely declarative. Section 15, for example, prohibited the sale of alcohol to indigenous people. Otherwise, the Indigenous Act of 1850 was like a piñata with something for everyone who wished to exploit natives in California. For instance, Section 20 stipulated that any indigenous who was able to work and support himself in some honest calling, but was found, quote, loitering and strolling about, or of profligate course of life, could be arrested on the complaint of, quote, any resident citizen of the country and brought before the justice of the peace. If the accused indigenous person was deemed a vagrant, the justice of the peace would require, quote, to hire out such vagrant within 24 hours to the best bidder of any term not exceeding 4 months, quote, end quote. In short, any citizen could obtain indigenous servants through convict leasing. Another section established the apprenticeship of indigenous minors. Any white person who wishes to employ an indigenous child could present himself before a justice of the peace, accompanied by the parents or friends of the minor in question, and after showing that this was a volunteer transaction, the petitioner could get custody of the child and control, quote, the earnings of such minor until he or she obtains the age of majority. 15 for girls, 18 for boys. The apprenticeship provision works in tandem with yet another section of the Indigenous Act of 1850 that gave justice of the peace jurisdiction in all cases of complaints related to indigenous people without the ability of indigenous to appeal at all, quote unquote, and quote, in no case could a white man be convicted of any offense upon the testimony of an indigenous person or indigenous peoples. Understandably, these provisions gave considerable latitude to traffickers of indigenous children. In North California, this trade flourished, especially in the mid-1850s, and it became so important that some newspapers began writing about the inhumanity of it. In 1857, the newspapers launched what one witness describes as, quote, an agitation against the California slave trade, and, quote, a general crusade. Very few traffickers were ever caught, however, and even those who were apprehended simply continued about their business after receiving just a slap on the wrist. So was the protection afforded by the law. These labor laws and the debates surrounding them harken back to early colonial days. California declared that indigenous people were free, but they were not free to be idle, in much the same way that the Spanish crown in the middle of the 16th century abolished indigenous slavery, but still compelled natives to work for their own goods. Chapter 11. A new era in indigenous bondage. The American occupation of the West did not reduce the enslavement of indigenous peoples. In fact, the arrival of the American settler rekindled the traffic in humans. Conditions varied from place to place, of course. As the gold rush played out, California experienced the greatest demand of coerced indigenous labor, but other territories had similar experiences. Easterners who had never participated in the market for indigenous people became immersed in it just by virtue of relocating to the West. The Mormons began arriving in Utah in 1847 and attained a resident population of 40,000 by 1860s and 86,000 by 1870, scattered in settlements all around the Great Lake, the Great Salt Lake, and south of it. They eked out a living in the desert with considerable difficulty. With respect to slavery, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had no set doctrines. However, Brigham Young, undisputed Mormon leader, believed that slavery have always been a part of the human condition. Eve partook of the forbidden fruit, and this made a slave of her, end quote. He affirmed in a major speech, quote, Adam hated very much to have her taken out of the Garden of Eden, and now our old lady says, I believe I will eat of the fruit and become a slave too. This was the first introduction of slavery upon the earth, end quote. Young went on to explain how Cain murdered his brother Abel for this crime. God put a special mark on all of Cain's descendants. Quote, you will see it on the countenance of every African you ever did see upon the face of the earth, or ever will see. I told you. Some of the earliest Mormon pioneers possessed black slaves, and the Compromise of 1850, a set of congressional bills designed to diffuse the confrontation between slaves in the Free State, permitted Utah to decide whether to legalize chattel slavery by popular sovereignty. Interestingly, Mormons had an explanation for the previous characteristics of indigenous slaves they encountered in the West. According to the Book of Mormon, in ancient times, different tribes of Israelites crossed the New World. These tribes warred with another until the only savior were the descendants of Laman. For this reason, Mormons often refer to indigenous people as Lamanites. Like the Africans, the Lamanites were cursed by God, assumed a, quote, dark and loathsome countenance, and over the centuries grew fierce and warlike. Cutting off the teachings of God, the Lamanites became a degraded people. But since they were originally from the blood of Israel, and therefore God's chosen people, there was a glimmer of hope. One day the Lamanites could, quote, blossom as a rose on the mountains. As Wilford Woodruff, the fourth president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, put it so arrestingly, quote, their chiefs will be filled with the power of God and receive the gospel, and they will go forth and build the new Jerusalem, end quote. This would be a magnificent redemption in which the Mormons could play a part. The path towards redemption between the enslavement, as the Mormons reached Utah in the summer of 1847, they began building a fort. The fall of band of Utes made camp in the vicinity. These indigenous people were just returning from raiding campaigns and had two girls whom they extended to exchange for firearms. The Mormons were initially reluctant to trade. They were not accustomed to acquiring indigenous people's rifles were scarce in Utah, and it was not wise to arm the surrounding natives. As the Mormons could not agree on a deal among themselves, the Utes killed one of the prisoners and began torturing the other on about 7 years of age. The traffickers made it clear that they would kill her unless a rifle was forthcoming. Charles Deckers, Brigham Young's son-in-law, was the first to break down. He gave up his gun and took the girl. She was the saddest looking piece of humanity I have ever seen, recalled one witness. They had shingled her head and butchered. News of this transaction quickly spread. Over the next years, indigenous peoples living in Utah made their way to the Mormon settlement, offering captives. Oh my gosh. These traffickers expected willing customers, but they were prepared to use the hard sell, displaying starving captives to arouse the pity of potential buyers. A Ute chief named Hold on a second. Brigham Young recalling, I have oh my god. I'm not reading this shit. They're putting the Mormons in a fucking neutral position, I feel like. I gotta do something. Hold on, everybody. Oh my god. Can you ever get this? There we go. I'm reading ahead because I don't like how I don't like this. By 1850 and 1851, Brigham Young had become persuaded that the way to move forward was to buying indigenous peoples. The Lord could not have devised a better plan than to have put the saints where they were to help bring about the redemptions of the Lamanites and also make them a white and delightsome people. Young said to the members of the Iron County Mission on May 1951. Other church leaders were less enthusiastic. The Lord has caused us to come here for this very purpose. As Orson Pratt, one of the original Mormon apostles, in 1855, that we might accomplish the redemption of these suffering, degraded Israelites. They're calling indigenous people Israelites. Yet, there was one major drawback. By buying indigenous children, the Mormons would be given impetus to a terrible traffic that caused bloodshed, mayhem, and war. Therefore, Brigham Young's solution was to steer a middle and contradictory course. He cracked down on some traffickers, but also advocated the passage of the Act for the Relief of Indigenous Slaves and Prisoners of 1852. Was enabled Utah residents to become guardians of indigenous minors for up to 20 years. In this way, Young intended to curb the most brutal aspects of the indigenous slave trade, at the same time persuade the Mormon goal of indigenous redemption. See, the Mormons didn't do, Jesus Christ. New Mexico traffickers were the first to deal with the effects of Young's policy. For 70 years, Hispanic merchants had been involved in the overland trails to California and had grown accustomed to bartering horses and slaves along the Old Spanish Trail, which cut a swath through Utah. This was still the case in fall of 1851 when the New Mexican from the Algonquin named Pedro Leon Lejeune found himself leading a party of merchants through the central Utah. Lejeune was bearing a trading license from the governor of New Mexico, and his intention was to barter for captives. But Lejeune was a prudent man. He knew that his license was about to expire, so he sought out Brigham Young's to extend it. Lejeune and his companions spent days tracking down the Utah governor. But when he found Young, the meeting did not go well. Through the interpreter, Governor Young explained that since the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the laws of the United States applied in Utah. Such law, he said, prohibited the enslavement of indigenous people, an argument that must be amused and hardened. New Mexicans, also predecessors, had operated in contraventions of Spanish and Mexican laws since the 16th century. The Mexicans listened with respect, observed the interpreter, and all seemed satisfied and pledged their words that they would return to their homes without trading for children. However, on the way back to New Mexico, Lejeune did acquire some indigenous children and one woman, perhaps forced by the circumstances, as he would later testify, but more likely the defiance of the governor's prohibition. In any case, he was subsequently apprehended, tried, and found guilty. Lejeune's property was confiscated, including the captives, whom were promptly placed in Mormon homes. The trial of conviction of son Pedro Leon Lejeune sent a clear message to New Mexicans wishing to do business in Utah. It was an important precedent, but it did not spell the end of the traffic of indigenous peoples. In 1851, Utah was far larger than it is today. It included portions of Nevada, Colorado, and Wyoming, therefore utterly impossible to police. During the 1850s and 1860s, New Mexicans continued to Rajavis, with Utes and Danae at, at a lonely outpost, exchanging horses for humans. Lushan himself continued to own Paiute indigenous people, as the 1870 census reveals. Governor Young unforcibly interdiction merely drove the traffic underground and made it more difficult to detect, as had occurred in the centuries past. I'm sorry, Brigham Young was a fucking segregationist, and he believed in fucking. He was a pro-slavery. They're putting him. Brigham Young's next target was Chief Walakran, or the Hawk of the Mountains, as a Ute leader called himself. El Wakra was the most important supplier. Oh no, I'm not doing this. I am not doing this. Yeah, I'm not doing this. I'm sorry. This is too Eurocentric. Oh, I'm not doing this. See, it's looking the Mormons as something that they're not. This dude, no, this is not a good, no. Sorry, everybody. I am not doing this chapter either. I'm sorry, but I'm about to put this book down. I'm about to put this book down and start something new tomorrow. I can't do this. I don't have the adequate knowledge to combat some of this bullshit. I don't. This dude is fucking Euro. Oh, dude, I can't do this. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this. I'm sorry. I'm not doing this. I'm sorry, everybody. But that is completely incorrect about the Mormon past. Pinning Mormons as like the saviors and the ones that bring relief. That's fucking incorrect. It's fucking so incorrect. All right. So we'll take the next half hour to make a vote for next reading. I'm gonna put 2 up. Okay? Whoever's here, there's only 3 people here. Whoever's here, yeah, I can't do that. Look, there's no one in here. It's just you and me, Joe. No one else is here. Yeah, I know you are. I'm done with this book. When they put in the fucking Mormons as something good, fuck them. You're still here? Okay. All right. Let me go look for these 2 books, the titles and everything. And let me go find their page. Hold on a second. Let me go into the Discord server here. Yeah, I am not doing this. I'm sorry. When I get more knowledge, maybe we can revisit this book. But this book, putting Mormons like that, fuck you, you fucking sick fuckers, dude. Our words is our weapon. Hold on a second. Let me go look up this one. Okay, I got one. Let me get the other one. Let me get the other one. So we're gonna make a whoever's here, we're gonna do a little bit of a thing here. Let me get the other book. For now on, I'm gonna make sure a book is, an indigenous book is written by an indigenous person, not this white fucking bullshit person, you know? Is the future. All right, hold on. Let me go look at this one. All right, I got the second picture. All right. So, if anybody can run a poll, that'd be great. The first book in mind is this one. If someone can run a poll, let me show you the picture. The first one is this book. This is about the Zapatistas. Marcos, Commandant Marcos is part of the Zapatistas. It's an indigenous movement in Mexico. So, so there you go. There's that. Or keep that in mind. Here we go. Or, oops, wrong one. Or reread this one. This is about Standing Rock. This is Nick Estes. So number one or number two? Number one. Here's number one. Here's number one. Let me see if I get it. This is number one. This is number two. So either number one or number two. Number two. No, they're not going to do number two, then number one. We're going to either do one or the other, because after that, I've done my three, and I'm moving on to the next thing, and I was going to do the Vietnamese book. So either number one or number two. There's one vote for number two. Number two. Oh, in that case, you want number one? Okay, so we got a number one and number two. We need another person to break the rule. We need one more person, which we don't have. We don't have anybody here. So either... I don't put much books down. Number one or number two. So, number two and a number one. All right. Anybody else? There's just us three here? That's it? Huh. Well, there's Gabby. Maybe Gabby can make a ruling. Are you there, Gabby? Can you hear me? Are you able to join? Can you join? So we're doing a vote. We're either going to do... This is about Standing Rock, right? By Nick Estes, by the Red Nation. So that's Standing Rock. That's number two. Or we do number one. Sure, you can come up if you want. Right? Hey. Yeah. You. Again. Okay. Why isn't Joe coming up? I sent you the invite. I know. Okay, that's fair. Yes, I did. I sent you an invite. It's still there.
My
Can you
computer
hear
was.
me?
I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you. My computer was being weird. I was trying to join it. I was trying to join your live from my laptop, but it wasn't letting me go up. Like, I don't know how. I've never used TikTok on laptops before, but like, I don't see like any button to request up or to accept invitation. So I don't know how that works.
Yeah. All right. So we have two different books. This one is about the Zapatistas.
Hell yeah.
Subcommandant Insurgent Marcos. And then
Subcomandante.
yeah. And then we have this one by Nick Estes. It's about Standing Rock. Our history is the future. So we already have Rachel who wants this book, and we have Joe who wants this one. So I need more people to vote on it.
Well, I am sorry, Rachel, but I'm definitely going to vote for the book on Subcomandante Marcos.
Subcomandante Marcos. Okay.
Also, there's an echo on my side. I don't know why.
Because of me. I have to wear fucking headphones and shit. All right, so right now it looks like Marcos. It looks like the words are our weapon so far. So, I wouldn't mind getting Dooley's opinion, but I think they're asleep. So I'm gonna write down the results so far. So right now, and then I'll make my decision on my end. So right now we have what? Marcos. We have 2, and then Standing Rock. We have 1.